welcome to the talk. As Tim had mentioned, I'm Kat, and I'm the team lead at Portent. Thanks for being here. I listened to my very first podcast back in 2014, and I really fell in love with the storytelling aspect of this medium. After being in the marketing world after a couple years, I noticed that this was a gap. Not a lot of brands were sponsoring with podcasts. So I had a lot of questions about how one can run a sponsorship campaign, and this is what this talk came from. All right, so during the next half hour, we're going to talk about the growth in the podcasting industry. We'll talk about what makes podcast advertising unique, cover some advertising basics, so what you need to know if you want to run your own campaign. Then I'll actually show you how to run a campaign of your own. I'll share some client results, and finally, key takeaways. All right, so starting with the growth in the podcasting space. Over the last decade, monthly podcast listenership in the US has tripled. Today, 32% of Americans ages 12 and up listen to podcasts on a monthly basis. That's 90 million monthly listeners. How many of you are familiar with the podcast called Serial? Great. See that bump in 2014? Well, that was the year that Serial came out. And people in the podcasting world attribute success of podcasting to just this one podcast. As you can see, the growth remained consistent ever since. The increase in streaming platform has paved way for new listeners. Apple is no longer the sole distributor for podcasts. Today, they're available in Spotify, Pandora, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and many others. Plus, there are many aggregate websites that syndicate original episodes and share them with their own networks. Podcast hosts, they're also taking matters into their own hands by building and publishing content on their own websites. And of course, they're also promoting it on their own social channels, making podcast reach wider than it's ever been before. Apple remains the leading platform in the podcasting space, with Spotify and Pandora not far behind. There are 750,000 podcasts, 24 million episodes available in 155 countries and 100 different languages. Podcasts have come a very far way, and there's no signs of them slowing down. And advertisers, they're taking note. Here's a look at the advertising ad spend in podcasts over the last 4 years. As you can see, the year-over-year growth is quite significant. And today, we're at $678 million. By 2021, podcasting ad spend is expected to double and surpass $1 billion. So what makes podcasting so special? What makes it so unique? Well, for starters, podcasts offer a wide array of genres in nearly every niche. You can find a podcast that fits your ideal target audience. To add a little extra layer of relevance, you can even sponsor episodes that are directly related to your product or service. For example, if you're a time management software and you want to sponsor a business podcast, you can actually work with them to sponsor a podcast that's specific on time management. You really can't get more relevant than this. Compared to general population, podcast listeners are more affluent and better educated. In the United States, 29% of households earn income of $75,000. Amongst podcast listeners, that number goes up to 41%. With growth of smartphone speakers, people incorporate podcasts into their everyday activities. According to Edison Research, people listen to podcasts when they're driving, cooking, doing chores, and working out. And while people are able to partake in all those activities and listen to podcasts, majority of people report that when they listen to podcasts, that is the sole activity that they're partaking in. For marketers, this is a beautiful thing. This means that podcast listeners prioritize their audio content and pay very close attention to it. I want you to think about the last time that you were flying in an airplane and watching a movie that had an emotional scene. You might have seen the movie before, but something about the movie this time really got to you. And now you're doing everything you can to fight off tears. Without a doubt, I experience this every single time, even if I know that the scene is coming. This happens because you're so immersed in your content, and you have to do everything in your power to fight off all the other noise around you. The same idea applies to podcast listening. In order to know what's going on, you have to pay very close attention. podcasting industry refers to listeners as the unreachable audience because regular listeners, well, they generally are less exposed to TV ads. A recent study done by Deloitte shows that podcast listeners use ad blockers and pay for higher tier subscription services like Hulu Plus in order to avoid ads altogether. Additionally, podcast listeners are more likely to fast forward through commercials on pre-recorded TV shows. And while you can also fast forward through an ad on a podcast, people are much less likely to do so, especially if the ad is host-read. According to Edison Research, about 54% of listeners say that they're more likely to make a purchase if they hear about it on a podcast. Part of the reason is because listeners develop strong bonds with their host and sincerely trust their recommendations. Which brings me to my most favorite point. Podcast hosts, they have an authentic following. Regardless of the podcasting niche, the host is somebody who's an expert on that topic and who the audience truly trusts. It is no wonder why host-read ads continue to be the preferred ad type, making up nearly 3/4 of the ads today. All right, so let's talk about podcast advertising basic. What do you need to know if you want to run a campaign of your own? Well, for starters, there are 3 different types of ad placements. There's the pre-roll, which runs in the beginning of the episode, usually lasts for about 15 to 30 seconds. Then there's the mid-roll, which runs in the middle, and it's the longest. It usually lasts about 60 seconds. And lastly, there's post-roll, which runs towards the end of the episode for 15 to 30 seconds, usually before the final credits. Most people listen to about 93% of an episode, and they're most engaged during that middle. So naturally, mid-roll ads tend to be most expensive, followed by pre-roll and post-roll. When we do podcast advertising for our clients, we aim for the mid-roll ad placements. And if we can't do that, then we go after the pre-roll ads. But just a fair warning, not every podcast host is going to treat their ads the same way. So when you do reach out to them, it's going to be important for you to find out exactly where the ad will be played. There are 2 different types of ad types. There's the baked-in ad. Think of this more as the permanent evergreen ad. Those ads get recorded during the show and remain part of the episode until the host decides to take that episode down altogether. From our experience, those types of ad tend to sound more organic as the host will weave in the ad into the episode. And while it's possible for the dynamically inserted ads to also be host-read, they don't always sound organic because they're inserted into the episode on demand. Once that episode reaches the expected number of downloads, the host will take out the ad and put in another sponsor. In doing so, hosts can monetize the same episode over time and in turn make a larger profit. As a sponsor, you want to consider this type of ad if you're running a seasonal campaign or if you don't care about the evergreen exposure effect. The most common type of podcasting campaign is the direct response. This is when a brand promotes some sort of an offer or a product sponsorship and people then use a checkout code. This type of a campaign works best if the offer is exclusive to the podcast, meaning that they can't find that offer elsewhere. Alternatively, brands can run a brand awareness campaign, which is pretty straightforward. You can have the host talk about what you're doing in the space, what your mission and vision is, that sort of thing. When it comes to measuring performance, you want to track the number of episodes each episode receives. You also want to take a look at your growth in organic and direct traffic during the duration of your campaign. And then you'll need to stay on top of your engagement metrics. So once people are getting to your website, what are they doing? How are they engaging with it? Are they bouncing? Are they exploring? And of course, if you're running a direct response campaign, you're going to take a look. You need to pay attention to the number of claimed offers that were claimed. When it comes to pricing, things are not always cut and dry. There are many factors that go into it, but the main one being is the popularity of the podcast. Here's an example of 4 business podcasts that vary vastly in their popularity. The bigger podcasts, which are on your left, have greater exposure, but they are much more expensive. They use dynamically inserted ads, and they have very straightforward pricing, so their rates are not flexible. On the other hand, the smaller podcasts, which are on your right, there's much smaller in exposure, but they are more affordable. They offer baked-in ads and have more flexible rates, which means if you sponsor a bundle of episodes, you're likely to get a better discount. The main takeaway here is that cost is not always proportionate to the number of downloads. And pricing, it changes over time. If you were to reach out to these same podcasts today, you might get pricing that's very different from this because the podcast might have grown a lot in popularity. So let's talk about running your own campaign. This is the 4-step process we use at Portent. So first, you start by conducting your own research. You get to know the niche and available podcasts in the space. Then you create your campaign assets, solidify the nitty-gritty details, and lastly, you're going to monitor your results. So starting with the research stage. Say you've never listened to a podcast in your entire life. You have no idea how to get started. What we did here is literally started Googling science podcasts. In this example here, we're interested in science podcasts, and so we looked at different roundups that were available. So for example, the 20 best science podcasts that you see here. Once you find podcasts that you think are a fit, take a look at who else sponsors that podcast. There are 2 ways of doing this. The first way is to check to see who else that podcast is being advertised on by looking at their advertisers page. And then you can also check the show notes to see who recently sponsored the episode. Lots of podcasts list their sponsors this way. So you're probably thinking, why do I care about who else sponsored the podcast? Well, because this can help you learn which podcast brands are investing in. And you can see companies that may be targeting a very similar demographic, then use tools to figure out who else they've sponsored and reach out to those podcasts. Here's an example of a tool that we have, Ahrefs. And what we did here is try to figure out who else Audible was sponsoring because it very much applied to our client. And so what we did here was run a backlink analysis to figure out who else was linking to Audible and they were sponsoring. Why this is important is instead of going down a rabbit hole and taking a look at all the science podcasts, this is your shortcut, right? You know that brands are interested in these podcasts, and from there, you know who to sponsor. And if you don't have access to Ahrefs, you can run backlink analysis using many other tools like Moz, SEMrush, Majestic. This is the last part of the stage. Once you figure out who it is that you want to sponsor, you'll need to reach out to every single one of those podcasts and ask them about their downloads, the ad type that they use, cost of the mid-roll placement, and then minimum of number of episodes that you're required to sponsor. Some podcasts, they do a good job of listing this information on the websites, but for the most part, you're going to have to reach out to every single one of them. So feel free to use this template that we've used. All right, so creating campaign assets. You need to create talking points and, if possible, some kind of an offer code that gives people incentive to visiting your website. This example here, we put together talking points for one of our clients, which is a documentary streaming provider called Magellan TV. Notice the talking points are listed in the bulleted list format. The key here is not to create a script. When you do that, you're very much limiting the host and not allowing them to kind of pick and choose what they want to say about you as a sponsor. Something really cool that we did here is that we also gave host free trial of Magellan TV and asked them to watch a couple episodes and speak to the content that they've personally enjoyed. Anytime you can do that, that is a great opportunity because that is going to be the most authentic sponsorship endorsement. And then the copy you see at the very bottom here is the copy that we asked them to use within their show notes mention. So asking them to link back to Magellan TV and then the genre that we were interested in sponsoring. Next, you need to design and develop a dedicated landing page. This is where you're going to be sending your traffic. So in our instance, we were sending people to magellantv.com/the name of the podcast, which was AstronomyCast. Treat those pages like your traditional PPC landing pages. If you don't know what those are, that means that the page has to be no index and no follow, because you don't want search engines to find this landing page. You only want people that type in that exact URL find this page. This also allows you to create a very unique environment for first-time listeners, which is pretty cool, right? You can say whatever you want about your brand, your key takeaways, and really get them engaged here. And then additionally, these custom welcome pages help you segment podcast listeners to better understand which podcasts are performing best. All right, so finalizing campaign details. During this stage, you want to contact podcasts to confirm their availability. If you're working with smaller podcasts, they'll want to start a sponsorship fairly quickly, which is why it's important to have your talking points and a landing page built out ahead of time, or at least templates of them, so you can work with them very quickly. But if you're working with bigger podcasts, you'll likely be able to start sponsoring them for a couple of weeks. In fact, we've had podcasts that we wanted to work with that were booked out 6 months in advance. So if you want to work with the bigger ones, really need to act fast. And then when you do reach out to them and tell them that you want to sponsor them, be sure to tell them about who you are as a brand, right? They're going to care about whether or not you're a good fit for them. So it's very important to do this. And then once dates are secured, you want to create new segments in your tracking platform, so then you can take better notes of who it is, which podcasts are your top performers. So in this example here, again, using Astronomy Cast, we created a segment which captured everybody that was visiting from the domain of the podcast, which was astronomycast.com, and then anybody who landed on that dedicated landing page, so magellantv.com/astronomycast. This will be key in helping you decide which podcasts you should keep and continue sponsoring and which ones you should scrap. And then comes the fun part. You've been doing all this work and now you get to watch it come to life. So once the sponsorship air, be sure to listen to the episode. You don't have to listen to the whole thing. You can just find, your pre-roll, your mid-roll ad. Make sure the sponsorship sounds the way you want it to sound. Also, pay attention to the show notes. Did they reference you correctly? Did they link back to you correctly? Here's an example of what the show notes look like for Magellan TV. Very similar to what we had asked them to do earlier in the talking points. Remember, there are real people that are publishing these episodes, so there's a lot of room for error. And then you're going to want to track your user engagement metrics. So at this stage, you're going to take a look at the number of pages people go to once they have arrived from the podcast. Look at the time they've spent on site, and then the bounce rate. If people are leaving very fast or they're not spending time exploring your content, the podcast audience is probably not a great fit for you. And then now that you've made it all the way through, you wait to see how the episodes perform, then figure out which podcasts you should keep and which ones you should get rid of. And then you do this process all over again. But this time, it's going to be easier, right? Because you've already conducted your research. You already know which other podcasts you want to work with. You've already created campaign assets, so you can just reuse those templates over again. Finalizing campaign details, you already know when some of those episodes will be able to go live next. And you already know how to set up tracking to monitor your results. Okay, so let's talk about podcast advertising examples. We had a client that wanted to become a top-level domain authority in the bod building space. And their website was very much in an infancy stage, competing against big names in the space. So they published their content on a regular basis, but we were still challenged with cultivating and nourishing an organic search momentum. In efforts to generate brand awareness for them, we built a podcast advertising strategy around their target persona, a business owner and a bot enthusiast named Greg. For the purpose of this campaign, we had a $36,000 budget, which we managed to stretch across 4 months. From that budget, we worked with 10 different podcasts and were able to sponsor 48 episodes. The result, 800,000 downloads. Now, compared to the site average, podcast listeners, they spent 127% more time on the website. They also saw 40% more pages. The bounce rate was much lower, 24% lower. And we had a higher return rate of 7%. Now, additionally, this campaign resulted in 400 links, which, as you may or may not know, are important for rankings, discoverability, and of course, referral traffic. We also got 200 no-followed links, which are not as useful for rankings, but do help with that referral traffic. And during the 4 months, we saw an increase in traffic, in organic traffic by 222%. Now, of course, not all of this came just from podcasts. We were publishing content regularly and it was ranking much better. Nonetheless, this is a pretty spectacular percentage. The other cool thing that we learned from this campaign is that bigger podcasts weren't always equal to best results. So this is an example of 3 different podcasts that we sponsored. The 100,000 MBA had the highest downloads, and then Hack the Entrepreneur at the very end had the least amount of downloads. But overall, when it came to visitors, that middle podcast was the best performer. That middle podcast, Developer T, also gave us the most page views. And then lastly, when it came for time on site, Hack the Entrepreneur visitors spent more time engaging with the content. So after this campaign, we actually ended up getting rid of the bigger podcasts and investing our money into the smaller ones. So what are the takeaways? Well, the first thing is learn from your competitors' strategies. If people are investing in podcasts, there's a pretty good reason why. Take advantage of smaller podcasts. You don't have to go after the bigger podcasts just to, start doing this sort of a campaign. It's also an awesome opportunity for you to test the field and see if this is even right for you. Get in early. This is something that takes a while. As you can see, there's a lot of back and forth, so it's important to give yourself some time. Aim for mid-roll and baked-in ads. And if possible, ask for package deals. That's going to be how you can save the most money and invest in most episodes. And lastly, work with enthusiastic hosts, because their enthusiasm is going to carry over to those ads. And then if you want to learn more about podcast advertising, we've been publishing a lot about this on our own website, so feel free to check it out.